the light rail and Ford, the referendum. And we didn't know, I certainly didn't know anything near the base of information or knowledge that I now have about all these things we've heard talked about this morning. But I thought to myself how interesting it is this many years later to have Randall and this wonderful cast of experts come back and speak to you who now we've been through it. We continue to read about it in the paper, hear about it on the news, hear about the constant drip, drip, drip coming from local government, and now we get it, don't we?
Yeah.
So now when we hear these presentations, the pieces start coming together. So I am so delighted that so many of us came out and made a Saturday afternoon and morning out of this, and to be able to support and to learn more as we continue, as we know, towards more referendums in our future. So our next panel is fantastic, as the others have been. And I'm going to introduce, first of all, Chris Spencer. I've known Chris for several years. Chris is currently a government consultant in Gray Robinson's office. Gray Robinson is a partner of Autonomous Florida, who advocates that Florida be on the leading edge with autonomous technology. Chris served, and some of you may remember when he served as Chief Legislative Assistant to State Senator Jeff Brandes during his 4-year tenure as Chairman of the Senate Committee on Transportation, and during the 2017 and 18 budget year when he served as Chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, Tourism, and Economic Development. Prior to his work with Senator Brandes, Chris served as Chief Legislative Assistant to State Representative Clay Ingram during his tenure serving as Vice Chairman of the House Transportation and the Highway Safety Subcommittee. So that's a great background of information in transportation. And Marc Scribner is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. In addition to transportation, land use, and urban growth policy issues, Marc focuses on emergency transportation technologies such as automated road vehicles and unmanned aircraft systems. Who doesn't know all about unmanned aircraft systems? I mean, he obtained his degree in economics and philosophy from George Washington University. And Marc, I've had the privilege of attending other conferences where he's been a speaker at that, and you're in for a treat from both of these gentlemen. So I'll bring up Marc first.
Thank you so much, Marc, and thank you all for being here. As the title of my presentation indicates, I believe the future of passenger service transportation is trackless and driverless. So a lot of the things that we typically hear from politicians aren't in the future as I imagine it, and as a growing percentage of the transportation industry also imagines it. So I'm going to provide an introduction to automated driving systems, just give you some basic definitions so that we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk about mobility advantages of automated driving systems over the technologies that are in use today. I'll give a brief overview on the role of public policy in ADS deployment. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues of planning under uncertainty. And Sharon sort of touched on that earlier with the Senator Brandeis quote on, we're driving in the fog, what do? We slow down. That's going to be the overall theme of that final section. So, what am I talking about here? Here's the official definition from the Society of Automotive Engineers, recommended practice date 3016. ADS is the collective hardware and software that are collectively capable of performing the entire dynamic driving task on a sustained basis, regardless of whether it is limited to a specific operational design domain. This term is used specifically to describe a level 3, 4, or 5 driving automation system. What does that mean in plain English? Cars that have limited to full self-driving functionality, and that by that I mean the car is directed by a computer, and that computer is able to direct the car in most or all driving situations. So, some examples. There we go. So this was the original Google self-driving car prototype. This is Randall and I had an opportunity to get a test ride in this back in 2012 in Washington, D.C. This is conditional driving automation. So you have a human being behind the driver's seat, ready to take control if the automated driving system can no longer handle that or there's a failure. So you have a user fallback there, a driver fallback. Next is level 4. This was the second iteration of this little pod car, was the second iteration of the Google self-driving car project prototype. This is high driving automation. There's no user fallback. This is when you can start talking about taking out manual vehicle controls, the steering wheel, the pedals, but it operates in a restricted operational design domain. So that means maybe it's lower speed, maybe it's geographically restricted, maybe it's limited to road type, maybe it's limited by weather conditions, but regardless, it's limited in some way that traditional driving is not today limited. And then finally, level 5, this is what everyone is seeking to get to, although in Q&A I can talk about why getting to level 5 isn't as important as some people say it is. But this is full driving automation. There's no user fallback, and the operational design domain is unrestricted. So it can go anywhere that a traditional human-driven car can go today. And when we're talking about replacing transit vehicles, traditional transit, or we're talking about offering driverless taxis, robo-taxis, what we're talking about is these levels 4 and possibly level 5 when we get there. So, there are a couple of different ways to look at this. You can deploy ADS in a variety of ways. The one which is the most traditional is, well, we're going to have private vehicles that you buy or lease from a dealership. You just won't have to drive them. They'll take you wherever you want to go. Next, you're looking at shared automated vehicles, the robo-taxis. This little thing is a Volkswagen prototype. It functions much like a small capacity taxi would. It's got 4 or 5 seats available for passengers, and that'll take you door to door wherever you want to go in the same way that a taxi does today. Next is you're looking at a shared fixed route microtransit shuttle. You're seeing limited operations around the world. In the United States, you're seeing these deployed in pilot programs anywhere from Las Vegas to Frisco outside Dallas. And these operate, like I said, on a fixed route, so they operate more like a traditional transit vehicle. But because of their small size, you're looking at lower operating costs. You're going to have potentially higher occupancies, and because of that, that means you can develop a larger fixed route network than you could under a high capacity transit vehicle network. And then finally, we'll get to high capacity transit buses. And really, you would only want to look at these in very high demand, dense corridors, and where you could platoon them. So you could achieve a level of capacity exceeding heavy rail transit if these buses are able to platoon. And I'm talking about limited locations. Think the approach to the Lincoln Tunnel in the exclusive bus lane used by New Jersey Transit as they're entering Manhattan. This could be very useful there in the future. And then there's other high capacity corridors where you may want to take a look at it. So there's been a lot of research conducted since probably about really starting in the last 5 years. We've seen a flurry of new research on this. And we have some areas of agreement, areas of consensus, but we also have a lot of uncertainty over what are very important aspects. So I'll just run through these. So on the consensus side, increased safety. About 19 out of 20 car accidents are due to human error or misbehavior. You know, even if you have some computer glitches, and I by no means mean to say that automated driving systems will be 100% perfect and that we'll never have a fatality resulting from an error. It's just right now, the carnage that we see on our roads today is almost all due to human error and misbehavior, and it is not very difficult to get down from those levels of error with a computer while still tolerating some errors in computer systems. Increased accessibility for non-drivers. If you don't have a driver's license, whether or not, you know, maybe you're disabled, maybe you're too young, you know, you don't have the kind of options, the kind of freedom that non-drivers have. And this is, you know, usually those folks are, unless they're super wealthy and can afford a private chauffeur, usually they're reliant on very expensive, unreliable paratransit service that really limits their options, because, you know, you're going to have to schedule that and then, you know, it'll pick you up, take you to your appointment, and then bring you right back. You don't have the kind of on-demand freedom that you do when you own a car and are able to choose wherever you want to go, whenever you want to go. Reduce costs for taxi-style services. Should also say reduce costs for transit too. The greatest share of operating costs for both taxis and transit is labor costs. Whether that's what you're directly paying right now in their wage and benefits, or their long-term pension costs. So taking the human out of this can save a lot of money and make this very economical relative to traditional mobility options. You can reduce demand for off-street parking. If you're in an urban area, a dense urban core, say you're in Manhattan, parking is very expensive there for a reason. But if you're able to, if the demand for off-street parking falls because you're able to operate a robo-taxi service that really never has to park except when it's refueling for a short period of time, you can get rid of a lot of that and convert it into higher value uses, whether that's residential or commercial, and transform your city that way. But this is also going to increase demand for short-term or curbside loading areas. We already see people talking about, well, how are we going to price curbs in the future? If everyone's in a driverless Uber-style vehicle, you may end up with some endpoint congestion or pickup congestion. What do you do with that? And like we've heard earlier, the best way to deal with congestion is through pricing. So we're likely going to have to do that in very dense areas. Again, think Manhattan, not necessarily Tampa or Pinellas County. Now here's where they're contentious, where the research goes all over the place and gives you very large ranges of negative and positive. Ownership trends, and I should include lease trends in there too, because there may be, due to liability concerns from manufacturers, they may not want to actually sell you, the private citizen, a vehicle. They may want to lease it so that they can manage over-the-air updates and maintenance and things like that they just can't do if they were to sell it to you outright. This is something that the dealers and the automakers are already trying to work through. And some of this is going to depend on which state you live in and what the liability regime is in the state. So this is a contentious area of research. Some people say that everyone's going to live in urban cores and they're just going to use the shared taxi style self-driving vehicles. Other people say, and I'll get to this gets into land use trends, another one of these later, is that, well, if you reduce the cost of transportation much, especially the time component of that, where you could commute from long distances in the far-flung exurbs or rural areas into an urban area, but you don't mind because you're able to be productive or sleep or whatever in your car, maybe you would want to actually buy one of these, and you'd be able to afford it because you'd be paying much less in real estate prices out in rural or exurban areas. Vehicle miles traveled, trip generation, trip length, we don't know. And this is one of my favorite research topics on this, because of the published research, I think so far you see estimates for vehicle miles traveled in the future with high penetration rates of ADS, ranging from, I believe, a 60% reduction to 180% increase. So what they say there is, what that says is they have no idea. And this is all, it all depends on what assumptions you bake into the activity-based models that they're doing when they're trying to simulate this future traffic. Energy consumption. This both depends on VMT, depends on congestion, it depends on, it also depends on what's the powertrain. Are we going to have fossil fuel powered vehicles for the foreseeable future? Are we going to move to an all electric, both in the vehicle itself and in the electricity sector, because both of those matter in terms of energy consumption and how it's generated? We don't know. That's really independent of ADS development and deployment, despite some people like to talk about, to do self-driving cars, they need to be all electric, and certainly some politicians are pushing for that by mandating that they be all electric, but those two things have nothing to do with one another, they're separate. And then urban congestion, like I said, we don't know what this is going to do in terms of vehicle miles traveled or trip generation. A lot of that depends on, well, what is the price of this vehicle when it's purchased by a fleet operator or yourself? That's going to, in part, determine what the average cost of operating this is, and that's going to determine your trip generation decisions and trip length and VMT and all the rest. So we don't know what urban congestion is. Urban congestion also depends on, are we actually going to finally start pricing roadways like economists have been saying for over half a century? Treat the roads just like any other utility, any other service, and actually start pricing away that congestion and using the road network as efficiently as possible. Because right now we've chosen not to. So that all depends on policy as well as on private decisions made once the technology is deployed. And finally, land use patterns. There's urbanists, when they talk about this, like to talk about sort of heaven and hell scenarios. We're going to get the heaven scenario for them is that everyone lives in a dense high rise and no one owns a car. That's just the new way of life, and this is going to facilitate that. Their hell scenario is that when the cost of transportation, both monetary and time, falls, that people are going to chase those cheap land values and accelerate the common pejorative sprawl even faster than it already is. So they hate that. I mean, I have the opinion it could be both, and people have varying consumer preferences over the course of your life. If you're younger and childless, being in a city can be a lot of fun, but if you have kids and you have a family and you have kids, you may not want to be in a one-bedroom, two-bedroom apartment where you have to walk down dirty streets to a dirty park for your kids to play. You may prefer to actually have a park as part of your house, what people call backyards. So we can see both, and those could change over the course of their life. And I think that is, there's nothing wrong with that. We could have, maybe it's not heaven and hell, we'll just have life on Earth. The role of public policy in automated driving system deployment. This is sort of the shortest one. I just want to give a rundown on sort of what the the responsibilities of various levels of government, and then certain things, to highlight certain things Florida has done in legislation in recent years. So with the feds, they deal with vehicle safety regulation. That's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. They're the ones who basically decide whether or not a car that's coming off the production line is safe enough to enter into Congress. So that's solely a federal jurisdictional matter. Infrastructure, the feds pick up a good chunk of the capital costs for our road and transit networks in this country. Privacy, you have the Federal Trade Commission dealing with that. Cybersecurity, maybe the Federal Trade Commission. They're working on sort of these issues right now. These are still sort of questions. At the state level, states deal with licensing, they deal with registration, they deal with insurance and liability determination, they deal with infrastructure, they deal with traffic enforcement, and some states have, I'm thinking specifically California, have pretty robust, although kind of nonsensical in a lot of places, privacy rules in place. So there's a question there of who rules that domain, the feds or the states. Right now it's sort of both, and it can be confusing. And this is something developers want sorted out in the near term, just so they have that level of certainty. And then at the local level, they deal with infrastructure, they deal with traffic enforcement, and then land use. And I think this is the big one. The land use is the big one where they could either sort of make or break the full potential of ADS. And that is, are they going to start restricting the types of development in certain areas? Are they going to create urban growth boundaries? Are they going to prohibit certain vehicles in certain areas at certain times? We don't know. In an effort to influence land use patterns, we don't know. Hopefully not. Now, things that Florida has done. Florida was one of the first states to actually get a law on the books back in 2012 on this, Senator Brandis, and Florida, and Florida too, it's immense credit. Not only was it an early state, so it was kind of making things up as they were going along, which is very difficult, something that policymakers usually try to avoid. But they avoided pretty much all the pitfalls that California did, which enacted a law back in 2012 as well, and they've spent the last 6 years trying to deal with the awful regulatory burdens that they impose on themselves. Florida largely has avoided that, thankfully. Then they've since updated this. They eliminated the testing requirement originally back in 2012. This was solely for testing. Now it permits commercial deployment, public deployment, and it allows driverless with no operator present, which is a big thing, obviously, if you want to make a business case for these vehicles equipped with this technology. And then also in 2016, Florida was the second state after Utah to establish a truck platooning pilot. And actually, the Florida House this year repealed that pilot and passed legislation that would have authorized commercial platooning, but it was not able to get through the Senate. But we expect it to easily pass next year. 9 states this year authorized truck platooning in their states. It's up to 16 total. That's sort of one of my projects for the past 3 years. Has been trying to get states to do that, because that's when you get into, you need to have platooning authorized to get into. Some people talk about, well, a self-driving car needs to have a dedicated lane. It's like, no, well, that's not true. We actually have, if they were to require a dedicated lane, we have the technology to make this work today. What they're working on now is mixed traffic scenarios, so non-dedicated lanes. But if we were to dedicate a lane, so say we were going to have a managed lane in the future, it would be automated vehicle only. That's when you can pack these cars very tightly together and move them at 65 miles an hour down a highway safely. You obviously wouldn't want someone driving their car into that, because these are computer-controlled distances and speeds, and that would muck everything up. So, you'd be losing efficiency in addition to probably killing some people trying to do that. But that's when you get, this is more further out, for, at least when it comes to passenger transportation, when you want to look at that. But I think it's important to do it now. And really, all it requires is amending your tailgating law, but just providing an exemption, saying this section does not apply to vehicles with computer-coordinated speeds. Done. Easy peasy. So, planning under uncertainty. Now, if you're talking about large sunk investment, which is what all infrastructure is, in the face of great uncertainty of the unknown, particularly in the near term, like we're seeing with self-driving cars, what do? You delay those decisions until you have more information. So I think anyone, And right now, anyone, any place in the country talking about building a new light rail network in the face of this new technology and all of that uncertainty is just crazy and just not being a steward of the public first. Because that, we know that by the time a decade or so that it takes to bring one of these networks online, there's a very real possibility that you're going to have significant fleet penetration of self-driving cars at that point, which can solve a lot of the supposed problems that light rail or whatever is trying to solve. So I'll start with that. I want to talk about the virtues of dumb infrastructure, which is, I think, what roads are. And especially since we've been hearing a lot of talk at the federal level, but because of that talk on the federal level and throwing a little bit of money out there, you have a number of state DOTs and city public works departments that are now stuck in this smart city mindset where you have to have wireless technology deployed everywhere. And in fact, you don't. Because most of the engineers that are working on automated driving systems, as I said, are assuming that we're just going to have these standard dumb roads, low-tech roads. They're working on how to deal with mixed traffic on those roads, but they're assuming these standard roads. And frankly, they don't want one smart solution because there are a number of different ways to do a smart city, but if you pick one way and you have developers going in another direction, well, you just shot yourself in the foot and wasted all of this money to build out a smart city telecommunications network that doesn't work with the latest technology. I said enough mean things about smart city infrastructure. So one of the things specifically with smart cities is what's known as vehicle-to-vehicle communications, and specifically a protocol called dedicated short-range communications, which is basically Wi-Fi. And there are a couple of automakers who are really invested in this, who are seeking a federal mandate, but the current administration has shelved that mandate, which is largely makes the smart city push that we're seeing in some states and in some cities for V2V DSRC basically worthless now. And so that's actually because the feds dangled out the prospect of this mandate and this free money that these cities then wasted on a bunch of smart infrastructure. Well, now they're mad that they're not getting the mandate and that everyone is turning toward more advanced cellular connectivity, which is, I think, the direction where things are going. That's certainly where things are going in Europe. So the majority of the European automakers want nothing to do with DSRC. Ford has also signed on to cellular rather than DSRC moving forward. It's the 5G mobile coalition. And that's what's coming. We're going to be about to see a huge wireless telecommunications advance. We're on the cusp of that. And to not plan for that is just another, is just another example of them just not thinking straight. DSRC was actually invented back in the 1990s, and it's basically sat there worthless. But every 5 years they tell us it's right around the corner. It's right around the corner. But now we actually have a technology. And one that's going to be reliant on private cellular networks that isn't going to require any government spending, no new taxes because there's no new spending. So this is what I say the smarter city approach, as opposed to the smart city approach, is have this dumb road network, but then harnessing vehicle-to-vehicle communications. This could be perhaps even through your mobile phone, and then get that connectivity from existing private cellular networks. So, looking to the future, so local leaders, they really need to coordinate with their state DOT officials and MPOs on ADS deployment. We don't need a patchwork of semi-solutions on this. We should be thinking broad and bigger picture in terms of planning. And this means thinking about other investment besides those directly related to ADS deployment, such as transit. We also need to recognize that future telecom advances and workforce evolution are likely to further increase telecommuting, so that the strain on some of your transportation networks may in fact be alleviated, at least in part, due to people just working from home. And we see telecommuting is fast growing in the United States, and we expect as that technology improves further, particularly on the management side, on the ability to monitor employees while they're teleworking, we expect more and more to move in that direction, just because, you know, physical workspace is an expense. And it'd be great if your employees get to pay for that. So when it comes to mass transit, I think all the focus should be on maintaining the existing facilities rather than expanding those facilities. Randall talked a lot about the maintenance backlog problem that plagues the supposed transit leaders in this country. You know, we have a problem in transit. It's not new capacity. It's that we have crumbling transit infrastructure because they never bothered to maintain it over 30 years, and then we end up with a situation like Washington D.C., which maybe not, but quite possibly has entered a death spiral where they're seeing pressure to raise fares. While also seeing ridership decline. We expect both of those to continue diverging from one another, and that's why we're seeing right now all sorts of gimmicks, tax increases to try to fund and bail out just the operating costs of this, while not even doing a lot of the needed capacity reconstruction. Recognize the high cost of the first mile, last mile in transit. This is really why transit is not convenient for people. You don't want to walk half a mile to a station and then wait there and then get someplace, transfer, and then finally get to your destination and walk another mile. The Uber is already solving this. You saw initially when Uber came online, they thought that a number of transit agencies thought that these could be complementary, and that's true in some places. If you're going from one far end of a transit network to the other, perhaps you don't want to pay the full fare of Uber, and you're only going to use those at your start and end points. But for most urban trips, it's just more convenient to take a on-demand door-to-door service than it is to take a mass transit service. And there's really no way for them to solve this first mile, last mile problem. Despite that, they're going to say we need to try, and we're going to pour more and more money into solving this problem. Then it's just not solvable. I think a lot of mass transit systems, those agencies, need to prepare, at least in some way, start thinking about it, retiring those systems. As Randall's talked about, perhaps these agencies end up becoming zombie agencies when their primary purpose is paying off pension liabilities and infrastructure debt with your tax dollars until eventually winding them down completely. But if we end up with this scenario where we have these self-driving cars that are able to do door-to-door service at an affordable price, if you have equity issues then, if you have people who still can't afford that, but it wouldn't make any sense to operate a bus, a high-capacity transit bus with one person on it, give those people vouchers. Give the low-income folks vouchers if they can't afford to take this service. It makes no sense to operate a much more costly service for them and a much less efficient service for them than it is if you could just pay them to take an Uber. And like I sort of alluded to earlier, if we wind up in a situation where you have a dense corridor, high demand, and it's just not feasible to move as many people that want to move through that corridor as possible in these smaller self-driving cars, that's when you look at high-capacity automated transit buses, and you platoon them to achieve heavy rail-like capacities. But you don't start with that, and unfortunately, that's what a lot of transit agencies, including what I've been told that the Tampa Bay area is talking about, is that we need to have all sorts of dedicated, exclusive use lanes, even when we don't have the demand to support that kind of service. So, finally, when you get to areas, and there's already areas in the country that can use this, and certainly at peak hours, but if you end up with congestion, greater congestion resulting from the falling costs of transportation, the greater convenience of all this, so people are taking more trips, that's when you look at a pricing solution And it's a lot easier doing pricing than trying to come up with some sort of administrative permit-based systems where, and this is, frankly, this is what a number of planners are talking about right now, is restricting access in urban cores during peak hours to only people who have a permit to do that. There's no reason to do that. You don't need to have the government discriminate against people based on their ability to please a bureaucrat or meet certain criteria that a regulation says. Charge them a price. Price it like a service. A lot easier than trying, and a lot fairer than trying to do something through government fiat. So with that, thank you very much, and look forward to any questions.